The stranger rode onto Henrietta Wallace's land like a storm that had not yet decided how much damage it intended to cause. It was the summer of 1874, deep in the territory of Kansas, where the sun beat down on the flat earth like a blacksmith's hammer on hot iron, and the dust rose in yellow curtains along every trail that cut through the scrubland. Henrietta had been awake since before dawn, the way she always was, because there was no other way to survive on a claim of 340 acres when you were doing it alone. She had been mending the fence along the northern pasture when she heard the horse herd it before she saw it, the slow and irregular rhythm of hooves that told her the animal was suffering, moving on sheer stubborn will rather than any strength left in its legs. She straightened up from the fence post, shaded her eyes with the back of her hand, and watched the rider come toward her across the baked earth plain. He was tall even in the saddle, which was the first thing she noticed, broad through the shoulders in a way that suggested he had worked hard most of his life, though his clothes told a different story than prosperity. His shirt was the color of old dust, his hat pulled low against the white hammer of the sun, and there was a rifle in the scabbard along his saddle and 2 revolvers on his hips that she could see from 40 yards away. His horse, a dark roan mare that had once been a fine animal, was stumbling, lips gone pale with dehydration, and the man himself was swaying slightly in the saddle with the kind of controlled, deliberate stillness of a man who knew he was close to falling and refused to give the ground the satisfaction. He pulled up at the fence line and looked down at her, and even through the squint of sun damage and exhaustion, she saw that his eyes were the particular hard gray of flint struck in low light. "Water," he said. It was not a question. It was barely even a request. It landed somewhere between a demand and a plain statement of fact, the way a man announces that the sky is above him and the ground is below. Henrietta Wallace had been living alone on this land for 14 months. She had buried her husband James in the spring of the previous year, a fever that came on a Tuesday and killed him by the following Sunday, the kind of death that felt like a clerical error, something that should not have been permitted to happen so quickly and so completely. She had kept the claim because she had nowhere else to go, and because James had believed in this land with the particular devotion of a man who had never owned anything before, and she had decided that his belief deserved to be honored even after he was gone. She had learned to plow. She had learned to fix a pump. She had learned to read weather and to shoot a rifle with the particular calm accuracy of someone who knew that her nearest neighbor was 6 miles east and that no one was coming to help her if something went wrong. She was 31 years old, and she had the kind of beauty that had nothing to do with softness, dark eyes that noticed everything, a jaw that said she had made decisions and stood behind them, and hands that were rough and strong now in a way they had never been when she was a girl in Ohio. She stood at the fence in her worn work dress and her sun-faded bonnet, and she looked up at the stranger on the suffering horse, and she made a decision. "Ride around to the well," she said, "east side of the house. I will meet you there." She did not wait to see whether he followed. She started walking back toward the house at a pace that was neither hurried nor slow, because she had learned that showing nervousness to strangers was the same as showing it to a horse. It made them unpredictable. She heard the roan mare's uneven steps behind her, tracking along outside the fence, and she rounded the corner of her small farmhouse and pulled the bucket from the hook beside the well and drew it up full. By the time the stranger had ridden around and dismounted, and the dismounting was slow and careful, the kind of dismounting that a man does when he is not sure his legs will hold him. She had the bucket in her hands and was moving toward the horse first, because the horse was obviously worse off than the rider, and because she had always believed that a man who would let his animal suffer past the point of necessity was not a man worth much. And she wanted to see what this man did when she offered water to his mare before him. He said nothing. He stepped back and let the horse drink, and he stood there with his hat in his hands watching the animal, and there was something in his face then, a gentleness that appeared and disappeared so quickly she almost doubted she had seen it, that revised her first impression of him slightly. She drew a second bucket and handed it to him, and he drank from it with both hands cupped, not caring that water ran down his chin and darkened the front of his shirt, drinking with the complete and total focus of a man who had been without water long enough for it to become the only thing in the world. When he finished, he looked at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "Thomas Hawkins," he said finally, as if the water had unlocked something that the talking part of him had been conserving along with everything else. "Henrietta Wallace," she said. "Where are you coming from?" "South," he said. "How long without water?" "Since yesterday noon. The creek on the Henderson property was dry, hit a patch of bad luck after that." Henrietta considered him. He was younger than she had first thought. The roughness of him had made her add years that were not there. She would have put him at 35 from a distance, but standing close, she revised that to somewhere around 33 or 34. He had a week of beard and a cut on his jawline that was new and had not been cleaned properly, and there were shadows under his eyes that were more than just the day's fatigue. "You are injured," she said, nodding at his left side, where the shirt lay against his ribs in a way that was not quite right, where a man held himself a certain way when something underneath hurt. He glanced down at himself as if he had forgotten. "Cracked rib," he said. "Maybe two. Nothing that needs tending." "You would like to be the judge of that, I expect." "I generally am," he said, and something moved at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. Henrietta Wallace had not planned to do what she did next. She had planned to give him water, wish him well, and send him back down the trail with whatever direction he needed. But the horse needed more than one drink, and the man needed food and probably a clean bandage on that jaw, and the afternoon was advancing toward the time of day when riding out into the open Kansas plain with a cracked rib and a dehydrated horse was less wisdom than stubbornness. "There is stew on the stove," she said. "You can eat and let your horse rest until the heat breaks. Then you ride on." He looked at her for a long moment. She could not tell what he was calculating behind those gray eyes, but she held his gaze steadily and did not soften it with apology or nervousness. "I appreciate it," he said, and the way he said it told her that he was not a man who said things like that easily. She brought the mare into the shade of the small barn and gave her more water and a measure of hay, and she checked the horse's hooves because one of them had been favoring odd, and sure enough the front right had a stone wedged in the frog. She worked it out with the hoof pick she kept hanging on the barn wall, and Thomas Hawkins stood and watched her do all of this without offering to help and without commenting. And she had the sense that he was a man who paid careful attention to people and stored what he observed for later use. Inside the house he sat at her kitchen table, and she put a bowl of stew in front of him and a wedge of cornbread beside it and a cup of strong black coffee, and he ate slowly and deliberately, not like a starving man cramming food in without tasting it, but like a man who had learned to eat with attention, because he did not always know when the next meal would come. "You are a drifter," she said. It was not accusatory, it was an observation. "I drift," he agreed. "That is not always the same thing as being one." "What is the difference?" He considered the question seriously, which she had not quite expected. "A drifter has no destination," he said. "I have destinations. I just tend to finish at them and then need another one." "What was your last destination?" "Dodge City. Worked the cattle trail up from Texas. Before that, a ranch outside of Wichita. And before that." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup and looked at her across the table, and there was something in the look that measured her, not in the way that men sometimes measured women as objects, as problems to be worked around, but more the way you measure someone when you are trying to decide how much truth they can hold. "The war," he said. "That was the last real destination that meant something. Everything since has been filling time." Henrietta was quiet for a moment. She understood something about filling time. She had been doing her own version of it for 14 months. "Where did you serve?" she said. "Army of the Tennessee, mostly Tennessee and Georgia. You?" "My husband served with Sherman," she said. "He came back whole and was killed by a fever 14 months ago." Thomas Hawkins set down the coffee cup with a carefulness that was its own kind of response. "I am sorry for it," he said. "Thank you," she said, and neither of them reached for more conversation immediately, and the silence was not uncomfortable the way silences with strangers usually are, but had a kind of weight to it that felt earned and honest. He helped her clear the table after he was done, which surprised her, and she said nothing about it, but she noticed it. He washed his own cup and bowl at the basin with the economy of a man who had cleaned up after himself in enough places to have made it a habit rather than a performance of courtesy. She wrapped his jaw with a clean strip of cloth she tore from an old linen sheet, and while she did it, he sat still on the chair and looked straight ahead, and she worked close to him and could smell the trail on him, dust and horse and wood smoke, and the particular heat of a man who had been riding hard in a Kansas summer. And her hands were steady and professional, and she did not let her awareness of him change the way she worked. "Thank you," he said when she was done, touching the bandage briefly with 2 fingers as if testing whether it was real. "It wants proper cleaning," she said. "Ride through Caldwell when you head south. There is a doctor there who is not a complete charlatan." "I will keep that in mind," he said. The sun was lower now, the heat breaking slightly into the first hints of evening, and he stood and she walked with him to the barn, and he saddled the roan mare, who was moving better now, the stone gone from her hoof and the water working through her system. He led the horse out into the yard and swung up into the saddle with a stiffness on the left side that told her the cracked ribs hurt considerably more than he had indicated. He settled in the saddle and looked down at her, and she looked up at him, and the evening light was turning the Kansas sky a deep scorched orange behind him. "You are alone out here," he said. It was not a question and it was not a threat. It was the way a person says something they have been thinking but have not been sure was their business to say. "I am," she said. "Is that by choice or circumstance?" "At this point," she said, "it is both." He nodded slowly, as if the answer made sense to him in some particular way. He touched the brim of his hat to her, a clean, deliberate gesture, and turned the roan south along the trail. She stood in her yard and watched him go until the dust and the distance took him, and then she went inside and washed the dinner dishes and banked the fire, and she told herself that was the end of that. It was not the end of that. 3 days later, in the early morning, she heard a horse on the trail again, and she came out onto the porch with the rifle ready across her arms, not raised, not threatening, but present and available, and it was Thomas Hawkins on the roan mare, riding north instead of south, and the horse was moving well, and he was sitting the saddle with something more like ease than he had 3 days before. He stopped at the gate to the yard and looked at her on the porch and then looked at the rifle across her arms with an expression that was entirely neutral, respecting the fact of it without offense. "I want to earn some work," he said, "if you have any." She studied him. "What kind of work?" "Any kind you need done that you cannot do as easily alone." It was a careful answer, not promising more than was being offered, not pretending he knew what she needed, just offering labor as a simple exchange. She thought about the north fence that needed 3 new posts before winter. She thought about the roof of the barn that had a soft spot over the hay storage that she had been climbing up to check every time it rained. She thought about the pump handle that had been giving her trouble, the threads worn down to where it took twice the effort to draw half the water. She thought about all of these things, and she thought about the fact that she had been alone on this land for 14 months, and the loneliness of it was something she managed the way you manage a chronic ache, by working hard enough that there was no attention left over for feeling it. "The pump needs work," she said, "and the barn roof, and the north fence." "I can do all of that," he said. "What are you asking in return?" "Meals and a place to roll out my bedroll in the barn," he said. "Nothing more than that." She thought about it for 3 full seconds, which was about what it was worth thinking about. A woman alone on a Kansas claim in 1874 with work that needed doing, and a capable man who was asking for nothing beyond food and shelter, was not a complicated equation. She was not naive about the risks. She had been raised with enough sense to know that not every man who presented himself as straightforward was. But she had read Thomas Hawkins in the brief time she had spent with him, and she had a good mind for reading people, always had, and what she read in him was not danger. "You sleep in the barn," she said. "You eat at the table. You do not go into the house unless I am present or unless I have said otherwise. Those are my terms." "Those are reasonable terms," he said. "I accept them." He was a hard worker, harder, even, than she had expected, which was already fairly high. He attacked the pump the first morning with the methodical intensity of a man who understood mechanisms and had patience for them, and by noon he had the thing apart and cleaned and reassembled and working with the kind of smooth, effortless draw that it had probably not had since it was new. He stood and pumped the handle several times, watching the water come up, and there was a brief satisfaction on his face that he did not bother to disguise. She handed him a cup of water from the bucket he had just filled, and he drank it standing in the yard and handed the cup back, and she noticed that his eyes were lighter in the full midday sun, less flint gray and more the pale blue-gray of winter water. "Where did you learn about pumps?" she said. "My father was a millwright," he said, "in Indiana. I spent every summer until I was 18 following him around and handing him things and listening to him talk about water and pressure and how things connect to make other things work." "Is he still living?" "No, he died in '68. My mother passed the year after." "You have siblings?" "One brother," he said, "Eli. He is in Missouri with a wife and 3 children." A pause. "We do not correspond much. The war put distance between us that geography just confirmed." She did not push on that. She knew what that kind of distance looked like, and she knew it was not a wound that strangers could do anything useful with. He fixed the barn roof on the second day, spending the morning up there with a hammer and a bag of nails she provided and lumber from the pile she kept beside the barn. And she could hear the steady ring of the hammer from the field where she was working, and there was something strange and almost uncomfortable about the sound of another person on her land. Not unpleasant, exactly, just unfamiliar in the way that something is when you have been without it long enough to have forgotten its texture. That evening she made fried salt pork and beans and cornbread, and he ate and she ate, and they talked more than they had the first evening about Kansas, about the cattle trade, about the way the land was changing as more settlers came west along the trails. He had opinions and he stated them clearly, and he also listened when she disagreed, which was not nothing. She disagreed with him about the future of small claims like hers. He thought the pressure from the big cattle operations would eventually make them untenable, and she said that the land meant too much to the people who had staked their lives on it to be given up without a fight. He considered her argument and said that she might be right and that he hoped she was, and the way he said it suggested he was not simply being agreeable. "You believe in this land," he said. "My husband believed in it first," she said. "I believe in it now because I have made it mine." "How did you and your husband come to Kansas?" "We came from Ohio in '69, she said. James had read every piece of homestead literature printed in the Eastern papers, and he was absolutely convinced that we were going to build something permanent here. He was the most determined man I have ever known. She paused. He was also funny. People do not always expect that in a farmer. But he could make me laugh harder than anyone. Thomas was quiet for a moment. What was he funny about? And that question, that particular thoughtful question that asked about the content of James's humor, rather than making a polite sound of sympathy, opened something in her that she had kept very tightly closed for 14 months. She told him about James. About the way James had once tried to teach himself to whittle, and produced objects so abstract and alarming-looking, that she had accused him of conducting some kind of experiment in terror. About the time James had tried to introduce a rooster to the flock, and the rooster had taken such immediate and complete dislike to him that James had spent 3 weeks negotiating a cold war with a chicken. About the serious, earnest passion James had for the land and for her, and for the idea that ordinary people deserved extraordinary lives. Thomas listened to all of it. He did not rush her or look uncomfortable with the emotion in her voice. He just listened with his full attention, the way very few people ever actually listened, and when she was done he said quietly, "He sounds like he was worth grieving." She had to look away for a moment and press the back of her hand briefly against her eyes. "He was," she said. "He absolutely was." They sat in the lamplit kitchen after the dishes were done, and the Kansas night pressed close against the windows with its weight of stars and cricket sound, and she felt the peculiar, complicated, slightly alarming sensation of being less alone than she had been in 14 months. He fixed the north fence on the third and fourth days, and it was hard physical work in the July heat, driving posts into ground that had baked to the hardness of fired brick, and she worked alongside him because 340 acres needed both of them, and also because she did not feel right standing by and watching while another person worked. He noticed this and said nothing about it, and she respected him for not making it a remark. On the evening of the fourth day, he told her he would finish the fence the following morning, and then he would move on. She was standing at the stove, and she did not turn around right away. She kept her hands on the pot she was stirring and felt the information settle into her like a stone into water, all the ripples from it spreading outward and then quieting. "Where will you go?" she said. "There is work at a horse ranch outside of Medicine Lodge," he said. "I know the owner. He offered me a position last spring and I never took it." "That is steady work," she said. "That is better than drifting." "It is," he said. She put dinner on the table and they ate and they talked about other things, and she did not let herself think about the fence finished and the roan mare heading south along the trail, and she told herself that was the sensible approach to the situation. In the morning he was at the fence line before she came outside, working in the early cool of 7 o'clock when the shadows were still long, and she made coffee and brought him a cup and they drank it at the fence line looking out across the flat Kansas plain that stretched all the way to the edge of the visible world. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask me anything," he said. "Why did you come back? 3 days ago. You had your water and your meal. You could have ridden on south, and I never would have known what became of you." He held his coffee cup in both hands and looked out at the plain. The early light was doing something to his face that the noon sun did not do, softening it, or rather, revealing something that was already there underneath the weathered surface. "Because you are alone out here," he said, "and there was work that needed doing, and I was not going anywhere particularly important." He paused. "And because the hour I spent in your kitchen was the most like being a person I have felt in a considerable time. I wanted more of that before I gave it up." Henrietta looked at him for a long moment and he looked back at her, and the morning light lay golden across the flat land between them, and the sky was the color of a promise, pale blue at the edges and deepening overhead, and she felt something shift in the architecture of herself, something that had been braced and locked for 14 months easing slightly, like a door opened against the weight of weather. She did not say anything that was equal to what he had said. She was not ready to. But she refilled his coffee cup, and she walked back to the house to start breakfast, and she told herself to be careful, and she started breakfast anyway. He finished the fence at 10 in the morning, and he came in and washed his hands and sat at the table, and she set a plate in front of him, and neither of them mentioned Medicine Lodge. He stayed. He did not announce that he was staying. It was not a conversation they had directly. It was simply that, when he finished the fence, he found other things that wanted doing. The west pasture needed clearing of a stand of dead brush before it became a fire risk, and the henhouse wanted a new door, and there was a section of the root cellar stairs that had rotted and was genuinely hazardous. He moved from task to task with the quiet, steady industry of a man who has found a place where his energy is useful, and she accepted the labor without requiring him to explain the impulse behind it. After 2 weeks, she realized that she was listening for him in the mornings, listening for the sound of him moving in the barn, the sound of the barn door, the particular sound of his boots on the porch step when he came to knock before coming in for meals. She realized this one morning while she was still in bed, lying in the gray pre-dawn light and listening. And then she lay there for a while afterward and felt the weight of what that meant. She was a 31-year-old widow in Kansas in 1874, and she had not allowed herself to want anything that was not directly related to the survival of her claim since the day she buried James. She had made herself a closed system, self-sufficient, sealed, functional. She had done it because she had to, and because she had been afraid of what wanting something she could not have would do to her. Thomas Hawkins was not something she could not have. That was the problem. He was there, in her barn, fixing things that needed fixing, sitting across her table 3 times a day, listening to her with his full and steady attention, saying things that were honest and considered and sometimes unexpectedly funny in the dry, understated way that she had discovered was just his particular manner of being in the world. He was there, and he was real, and she could see perfectly well that he was watching her with those gray eyes in a way that was not casual. She started paying different kinds of attention to him, the way you do when you admit to yourself that a person matters. She noticed that he had a habit of stopping completely still when he was thinking hard, the way some animals do, just going absolutely motionless while the thinking happened, and then starting back into motion when it was done. She noticed that he took off his hat whenever he came into the house and put it on the peg by the door without being asked, and that he had been doing this from the first day. She noticed that he was kind to the animals in a way that was total and unperformative. He talked to the roan mare while he groomed her, low and quiet, not in the babying tone some people used with horses, but conversationally, as if she were a reliable colleague. She noticed that he had a scar on his right forearm that ran from the wrist to halfway to the elbow, old and smooth, and that she wanted to ask about it and was not sure what it would mean if she did. One evening in the 3rd week, she asked. They were sitting on the porch after dinner, the way they had started to do in the evenings when the heat allowed it, in the 2 wooden chairs she had kept out there since James built the porch the first summer. The sun was going down in one of the elaborate Kansas performances that she had never quite gotten used to. All that orange and rose, and the particular scorched purple that appeared at the horizon just before the dark came. "The scar on your arm," she said. "Was it the war?" He extended his arm slightly and looked at the scar as if he had almost stopped noticing it. "No," he said. "That was before the war. I was 17. I was trying to prove something to some boys from the next town, and the thing I was proving it with was a piece of farm equipment that had no intention of cooperating." "What were you trying to prove?" "That I could be faster than I was," he said. "I was not faster than I was." The equipment made that point clearly. Were the boys impressed? "They were horrified, which in retrospect served the same social function," he said, and the dry humor of it caught her mid-sip of her evening coffee, and she laughed, a real laugh, the kind that surprised her when it came out, and he looked at her with the expression she had started to be able to read, the one that appeared when he said something that made her laugh, a kind of quiet, private satisfaction. "You are funny," she said, when the laugh had finished. "I have been accused of worse," he said. "Do you know that you are funny, or does it happen by accident?" "Mostly I am just accurate," he said. "The humor is a byproduct." She looked at him in the evening light, and he looked back at her, and she thought, this is the moment. She could feel it the way you feel weather changing, a pressure shift, something in the air between them that had been building for weeks and was now reaching the point where it either resolved itself or it didn't, and they were both aware of it, and neither of them was pretending otherwise. "Thomas," she said. "Henrietta," he said. She smiled at that, at the way he used her full name without trimming it, without turning it into Hetty or Nettie the way people sometimes did, just the whole of it, given back to her with a kind of respect. "I need you to tell me something honestly," she said. "I will," he said. "Why are you still here?" He was quiet for a moment, but it was not a hesitant quiet. It was the quiet of a man who is making sure he gets the words right. "Because I have not wanted to leave," he said, "and I have not wanted to leave because of you." Because you are the most remarkable person I have been around in a very long time, and because this land and this life that you have built here is something I did not expect to find on a Kansas trail in July. And because I think that if I rode south to Medicine Lodge, I would spend the rest of my days thinking about this porch and these evenings and the way you laugh. And I would rather know whether there is something here worth staying for than spend the rest of my life wondering. He said all of this in the same steady, deliberate way that he said everything, not performing it, not dressed up with any particular elegance, just honest and direct. And she sat in her chair and felt the words move through her and reorganize things. I am still in love with my husband, she said, in the way that I will probably always carry him with me. I know that, he said. I am not asking you to stop. What are you asking? I am asking whether there is room, he said quietly. Not to replace anything, just room. Henrietta looked out at the Kansas sky. The sun was gone now and the first stars were appearing the way they always did out here, not one at a time gracefully, the way the books described it, but all at once in great scattered handfuls, as if the sky had been holding them back all day and suddenly let them go. There might be room, she said. He reached across the space between the two chairs and placed his hand over hers where it rested on the arm of the chair. His hand was large and rough and warm from the summer evening, and she did not move hers away. They sat like that while the dark came fully in, and the stars multiplied across the dome of sky above the Kansas plain, and neither of them needed to say anything more than what had already been said. Things changed after that, and also they did not change, because the daily work of the claim continued the way it always had and would have to. The animals, the fields, the fence, the pump, the roof, the root cellar, the 100 small tasks that were the vocabulary of survival on Kansas land in 1874. But inside the work there was something different now, something that had been added to the air between them, warm and careful and building the way good things build. He kissed her for the first time a week later. They had spent the afternoon working a difficult section of field together, breaking ground that had hardened beyond the plow's easy reach, and they were tired and dusty, and the satisfaction of having finished the section was the particular animal satisfaction of bodies that have worked hard and well. She was washing her hands at the basin outside and he was standing a few feet away doing the same, and she looked up and he was already looking at her, and he crossed the distance between them and kissed her once, carefully, not timidly, but carefully, the way you approach something that matters. She kissed him back. They stood in the yard in the evening light and she pressed her palms against his chest and felt his heartbeat through the fabric of his shirt, faster than his exterior calm suggested, and she thought, here is a man who has been keeping himself very still on the outside for a very long time and underneath is not still at all. Henrietta, he said, her name in his mouth like it had weight and meaning. I know, she said. He courted her in the way of a man who understood that patience was not the same as distance. He brought her things he found on his rides around the property, a stone that had an interesting shape, a wildflower growing in an unlikely place, once a hawk feather of such precise and beautiful symmetry that she put it in the glass on the kitchen windowsill and looked at it every morning. He asked about her life before Kansas, about Ohio and her childhood and her family, and she told him and asked the same of him, and learned about Indiana and his father the millwright and a childhood that had been hard and poor but not loveless, and about the war years that had done something to him that he was still in the slow process of undoing. What did the war do to you? She asked him one evening in the kitchen, the lamp between them casting warm light over the worn table. You mention it the way someone mentions a country they once lived in. That is what it was, he said. He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. You go away for years as one kind of person and you come back as another, and the people who knew the first kind do not quite recognize the second. My brother Eli looked at me when I came home like he was trying to find someone who was not there anymore. He paused. I was not there anymore. I had left that version of myself in Georgia. Do you wish you could get him back, that earlier version? "No," he said, and the certainty in it surprised her. He was younger and he had not seen certain things, which is a form of kindness, but he was also smaller. He had not learned yet what he was capable of. He looked at her. "The war was a terrible thing that happened for terrible reasons, and I do not romanticize it, but I know what I'm made of now, and I did not know it before." "What are you made of?" she said. He considered the question with the full weight of his attention. "Endurance," he said. "And the knowledge that small good things matter more than large terrible things in the end, because there are more of them." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, the way he had put his over hers on the porch that first evening, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat in the lamplight, and the Kansas night gathered around the house, and the stars turned slowly overhead, and she thought about what he had said about small good things mattering more than large terrible things, and she thought it was possibly the truest thing she had ever heard anyone say. He told her about the years between the war and Kansas, the drifting, as he called it, though she now understood better what he meant by the distinction. He had worked the cattle trail twice, and before that a silver mine in Colorado that had turned out to be substantially less full of silver than its owners had claimed, and before that a stint at a livery stable in a small Missouri town, where the owner had been a good man who paid fair wages and treated his animals well, and whose wife had fed Thomas at her table without making him feel like charity. He had lived in a dozen places and belonged to none of them, and he said this without self-pity, but with a kind of clear-eyed acknowledgment of it that she found both honest and a little heartbreaking. "Did you ever want to belong somewhere?" she asked. "I wanted it so much that I stopped wanting it," he said, "because wanting it when you cannot have it is just a way of being unhappy. And now—" He looked at her across the table, and the lamp flame moved between them, and his gray eyes were warm in the light, warmer than she would have predicted when she first saw them. "Now I am cautiously reconsidering the question," he said. She laughed, and he smiled, a real smile, full and unguarded, the kind she had been seeing more of as the weeks passed, the kind that transformed his face from merely striking to genuinely beautiful in a way that she thought only she was privileged to see. August came in with a heat that was almost punishing in its completeness, the kind of Kansas August that felt like an argument against human habitation. But the work did not pause for the weather, and neither did they. They fell into the rhythms of the claim together. The morning chores and the field work and the afternoon repairs and the evening meals and the porch sitting that had become the hinge of every day, the part she looked forward to most, the part where the work was done and they could simply be present with each other. She watched him with the neighbors when they came, old Marion Cooper, who rode over once a fortnight from her claim 6 miles east, a woman of 63 with the iron constitution and permanent squint of someone who had been fighting the prairie her whole life and had decided to enjoy the fighting. Marion looked Thomas up and down on her first visit after his arrival with the particular evaluating eye of a woman who has seen much and been deceived little, and then she said to Henrietta, while Thomas was out in the yard with Marion's ancient draft horse, "He is a good one, that. I can tell it from here," and she said it with the finality of a judge reading a verdict. "I know," Henrietta said, and Marion gave her a sharp look. "Then do not wait too long," Marion said. "Good ones do not hold still forever." Thomas came back inside, and Marion was polite and faintly terrifying to him, the way she was with everyone, and he was respectful and not intimidated by her, and talked to her about her own land and her own crops with genuine interest, and Marion left looking more approving than when she had arrived. In the late evenings, after dinner and the porch sitting, Thomas would return to the barn, and Henrietta would go inside, and she would lie in her bed and look at the ceiling and have the kind of thoughts that she had carefully not allowed herself for a very long time. Thoughts about what it would mean to not be alone. Thoughts about what it would mean to trust another person with the land and the life she had fought to keep. Thoughts about Thomas Hawkins specifically, about the quality of his attention and the warmth of his hands and the sound of his voice in the evenings and the dry humor that appeared when she least expected it and the deep, patient seriousness of him that she found endlessly interesting. One evening in mid-August, there was a thunderstorm. It came across the plain from the northwest in the afternoon, the sky turning the particular greenish yellow that meant serious weather, and they worked fast to secure the animals and cover what needed covering in the fields. And then the storm hit and they ended up inside the house as the rain hammered the roof, and the lightning walked across the plain in great luminous strides. They sat at the kitchen table with cups of tea because the rain had made the evening cool enough to want something hot, and the storm roared around the house and the lamp flickered, and they were close in the small, warm kitchen in a way that was different from the ordinary evenings, more immediate somehow. The world reduced to this room and this table, and the two of them inside the circle of lamplight. "Tell me what you want," she said. Not the direct question she had been circling around, but close enough to it that he understood her. He looked at her steadily. "I want this," he said. "All of this. You and this land and these evenings. I want to stop drifting. I want to build something." He paused. "I want you to trust me enough to let me try." "I do trust you," she said. "That is not the question." "What is the question?" "Whether you will stay," she said. "People leave. That is the part of life I know the best." The storm was loud against the house, and the lightning flashed in the windows, and Thomas leaned forward across the table toward her, not touching her yet, just closing the distance between them to something that required him to lower his voice. "I am not James," he said, quietly and with precision. "I cannot guarantee you anything because no one can. But I can tell you that I have been nowhere in the last 11 years that I did not want to leave, and I have been here for 6 weeks, and every day I want to stay more, not less. I can tell you that you and this land are the first thing in a very long time that has felt worth staying for." He paused. "That has to count for something." "It counts for a great deal," she said. The storm broke around midnight and left the plain washed clean and the air suddenly cool and smelling of wet earth. And they stood on the porch together for a while, listening to the dripping from the eaves and looking out at the dark plain where the stars were coming back through the dissipating clouds. He put his arm around her and she leaned against his side, and they stood like that until the stars were fully out, and then she turned and looked up at him and said, "Stay. Not just for tonight, not just for tomorrow, stay." He understood her. "I am staying," he said. He kissed her in the clean darkness of the porch after the storm. And this time it was not the careful first kiss of a man measuring what was permitted, but the kiss of a man who had been told he was allowed to stay. And she kissed him back with the full weight of 6 weeks of wanting, and she felt him hold her as if she were something irreplaceable, which she was. The county land office in Caldwell was where they went on a Friday in September. Thomas in his best shirt and Henrietta in her good blue dress that she had not worn since James's funeral, which she acknowledged to herself, and then decided was not a bad omen but simply a matter of logistics. They had talked about it plainly and practically, the way they talked about most things. She owned the claim and would continue to own it, and his name would be added to the registration. And what they were building together was built on the fact that it was already hers and he was joining her, not taking over. The judge who performed the ceremony was a stout man named Abernethy, who had the air of someone who had married many couples in frontier country, and had made his peace with the fact that the ceremonies were rarely elaborate. Marion Cooper came as witness, and wore her good bonnet and cried in the quiet, dignified way of someone who considers crying an entirely appropriate response to appropriate occasions. Thomas had written to his brother Eli in Missouri, a letter that had taken him 2 evenings to compose, and that he had sealed without letting her read it, which she respected. Eli's response had arrived 4 days before the ceremony. She had seen Thomas reading it on the porch, seen the way his face moved through something complicated and then settled. And afterward he had told her that Eli had sent his congratulations and had said that he hoped Thomas had found what he had been looking for and that the family would like to meet Henrietta in the spring. "Did he mean it?" she asked. "I think so," Thomas said. "Eli is a straight talker. He does not say things he does not mean." "It runs in the family," she said. Thomas smiled. "We have our faults," he said, "but vagueness is not among them." Standing before Judge Abernethy with Thomas beside her, she took his hand, and she felt the steadiness of him through her palm, the solid, warm, real fact of him beside her on a September morning in Kansas in 1874. This man who had ridden onto her land demanding water and who had given her, without being asked and without conditions, the rest of his life. She thought briefly of James. She thought of him without guilt, with love and with gratitude and with the particular kind of grief that has done most of its sharp work and settled into something you carry without it cutting anymore. She thought he would have liked Thomas. She thought he would have approved of this morning and this man, and she held that thought gently and then set it aside and looked at the man beside her, who was looking at her with those gray eyes that she had learned to read like a second language. "I do," she said. "I do," Thomas said. Marion dabbed her eyes with her handkerchief, and the judge declared them married, and the courthouse clerk provided coffee, and a slightly stale cake that was nonetheless consumed entirely between the four of them. And then they rode home together along the trail under a September sky of such absolute and generous blue that it seemed like an endorsement from the land itself. The autumn was a revelation. She had been dreading it. In a private way she had not admitted to herself until it was suddenly not something to dread anymore. The turning of the land into the season that had killed James, the cold coming in, the isolation that winter imposed on the claims. But Thomas was there, and the isolation was transformed into something else, something she did not have a word for immediately and then found the word for: intimacy. The long evenings with the lamp lit and the wind pressing against the walls. The mornings in the warm kitchen with coffee steaming, and the day's work still ahead. The particular quality of snow on flat Kansas land, the way it turned the plain into something simplified and strange and beautiful. All of it was different with him. He was a man of consistent surprises. She learned that he read, that somewhere in the sparse contents of his saddlebag he carried 3 well-worn books, and that he read with the same quality of complete attention that he gave to everything, and that he would occasionally read aloud to her in the evenings in his low, steady voice, working through the pages without performance, just the words. She learned that he could not carry a tune but would sometimes hum anyway absently, while he worked, as if the humming were a byproduct of thinking rather than an intentional act. She learned that he had a deep and genuine interest in weather, not just the practical observation of it that every farmer needed, but a more philosophical interest in the fact of it, the way weather moved across the continent without caring about the lives in its path, and the way those lives adapted and persisted anyway. She learned that he had nightmares sometimes, left over from the war, not screaming nightmares but a quiet, tense wakefulness that she could feel even across sleep, and that the best thing she could do was to press her hand against his chest and say his name, and he would come fully awake and look at her in the dark, and the tension would go out of him like water out of a tilted cup. "You should have told me," she said the first time this happened. "I did not want it to change anything," he said. "It does not change anything," she said, "except that I know now and I can help." "Henrietta," he said, her name in the dark of their room, with a quality in his voice that she could only describe as wonder, as if he were still slightly surprised by the fact of her, still finding her presence remarkable after all these weeks. "Sleep," she said, and kept her hand on his chest, and he slept. Winter settled in properly in November, and with it came Marion Cooper for a long visit, 3 days that Marion had appointed herself to spend helping Henrietta preserve the last of the autumn vegetables, and which turned into 3 days of cooking and talking, and the specific pleasure of women's company that Henrietta had not realized she had been missing until it was suddenly in the room with her. Marion approved of Thomas with increasing specificity as the visit went on. She observed him fixing the barn door hinges on the first morning, and reported to Henrietta in the kitchen that he did it correctly, which apparently not all men did. She had a lengthy conversation with him at dinner on the second night about water rights and land registration, a subject she had strong views on, and he engaged with those views seriously and respectfully without being merely agreeable, and Marion said later in private, "He argues fairly. I respect that in a man." Thomas said, after Marion had ridden home on the third day, "That woman is formidable." "Yes," Henrietta said. "I like her enormously," he said. "She approves of you," Henrietta said, "which I understand is not universal." "I am glad to have earned it," he said, with complete sincerity. In the deep winter, when the work contracted to the essential and the evenings stretched long, they talked more deeply than ever, about what they wanted the claim to be, about whether they might expand it in the spring, about the future that was beginning to have a shape where before it had been merely a direction. He told her about his plans, careful, realistic plans, not grand visions, for improving the pasture yield and putting in a larger kitchen garden, and possibly adding a small apple orchard along the south side of the property, which the climate would support if they chose the right variety. She told him about her plans, the ones she had been sitting on alone for over a year because there was no one to tell them to, for eventually having a milk cow and expanding the hen house and perhaps someday having a small operation selling eggs to the town of Caldwell, which was growing fast enough that the local supply of eggs was chronically insufficient. They merged these plans together the way two streams join, her vision and his capability fitting together in a way that made both more than they were alone. "We need more hands," he said one evening in December, "not this year, but by next autumn." She looked at him across the fire. "What kind of hands?" "The kind that come with a ranch," he said, and then he looked at her steadily and let the other possibility of his words exist in the air between them. She felt the warmth of that possibility move through her. She had not let herself think directly about it yet. It had seemed premature, seemed like wanting too much, seemed like the kind of wanting that could be disappointed. But now he was saying it out loud in his careful, direct way, putting it on the table as something they could consider together. "Is that something you want?" she said. "Is it something you want?" he said. She looked at the fire for a moment. She thought about what it would mean. She thought about the space in the house, about the future, about the land that James had believed in and that she had kept, and that was now also Thomas's, and about what it would mean to make it more fully theirs. "Yes," she said. "I think it is." Thomas reached across and took her hand and held it, and neither of them said anything more about it that evening, but it sat between them like a warm and important thing, like something newly planted that had already decided to grow. January and February were the hard months, hard cold, hard wind. The prairie stripped down to its most elemental self, white and vast and indifferent. They worked through it together, maintaining the animals and the house and each other with the quiet competence of people who have decided to be equal to whatever the land requires. There were days when the wind was so severe that going out to the barn was an exercise in determination, and on those days they came back inside with red faces and cold stiffened hands and stood close to the stove and pressed warmth back into each other, laughing sometimes at the particular absurdity of the weather and the particular satisfaction of having beaten it. He started teaching her to whittle, which she had mentioned James's catastrophic attempts at, and it turned out that Thomas was actually quite good at it. His father's mechanical instincts had run to small things as well as large ones, and that she had some aptitude for it as well, though her first attempts were lumpy and self-deprecating. They spent several evenings at the kitchen table with knives and scraps of wood, and the result was a small carved horse of Thomas's that was genuinely lovely, and a small carved bird of Henrietta's that was considerably more abstract but which she felt captured the spirit if not the precise anatomy of its subject. She put both of them on the kitchen windowsill next to the hawk feather, and every morning she looked at them and thought about the evenings they represented, the specific warmth of those evenings, the lamplight and the wood smoke smell, and the sound of the knife on the wood and the low, companionable conversation. Spring came in March like an argument, warm one day, bitter the next, the land trying to decide whether it was done with winter or not. And with it came the revival of the full scope of the claims, needs, and demands. They expanded the kitchen garden as they had planned, turning new ground along the east side of the house, and Thomas put in the posts for the apple orchard, 24 young trees purchased from a nursery in Caldwell that were barely more than sticks but had, he assured her, 10 years of good growth in them. "I will be 43 when these trees are giving full fruit," he said, looking at the row of small plantings. "I will be 41, she said. "We will be eating apples in middle age," he said. "That is a specific and lovely thing to look forward to," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they looked at the row of planted sticks in the March afternoon, and she thought about middle age and apple trees, and the strange, good arithmetic of a future that had been rebuilt from the ground up by two people who had separately given up on a certain kind of possibility, and then found it anyway. It was in April that she was sure. She had suspected it for 3 weeks, but she had waited to be certain before she said anything, and now she was certain. She told him at dinner on a Tuesday evening, matter-of-factly, because that was the way both of them said important things, clearly, directly, without ornament. "I'm expecting a child," she said. The stillness came over him, the complete stopping that she knew meant he was doing his most serious thinking. And then he looked at her, and his face did what she had seen it do only a few times, the unguarded version of him, the one underneath the weathered exterior. And what was in it was not just happiness, but something that went deeper than happiness, something more like the word grateful, not performance, but the real experience of it. The kind that comes from having lived without something long enough to understand exactly what it means to have it. "Henrietta," he said. "I know," she said. He came around the table and he held her, and she felt him hold his breath for a moment and then let it out slowly against her hair, and she put her arms around him and held on, and the Kansas spring evening was all around them, warm and full of the sound of returning birds. "I am going to be a father," he said, as if testing the words for fit. "You are," she said. "That is," he stopped. "Yes," she said. "It is." He pressed his face into her hair, and she felt him laugh, quietly, privately, the laugh of a man surprised by joy. Summer of 1875 was a different summer than the one before it. She moved through it with the additional weight and the particular alertness of pregnancy, and Thomas moved through it with a protective attentiveness that was not hovering. He had too much sense to hover, and she had too much independence to tolerate it, but was present in 100 small adjustments. The way he took on the heaviest work without comment, the way he was always nearby without being underfoot, the way he watched her at the end of each day with a question in his eyes that asked how she was doing and accepted her honest answer. Marion Cooper came and stayed for 3 weeks in the late summer, officially to help with the preserving, but actually, Henrietta suspected, to be present for whatever came next, and Henrietta was grateful for it without saying so directly, and Marion was tactful enough not to require it to be said. Thomas sent a letter to Eli in Missouri announcing the expected arrival, and Eli wrote back a letter that was longer than any previous letter, and this time he let Henrietta read it, and she found in Eli's letter the voice of a man who had been carrying guilt about the distance between himself and his brother for years, and who was reaching, carefully and imperfectly, toward something like reconciliation. She handed the letter back to Thomas and said, "He misses you." "I know," Thomas said. "I have missed him too." "Right back," she said. "Tell him so." He did. The baby came on a warm September night, the anniversary almost to the week of Thomas's arrival on her land, though she did not calculate this precisely until later. And it was a long labor that Marion managed with the calm efficiency of a woman who had brought several frontier babies into the world. And Thomas was in the barn because Marion had put him there firmly at the beginning of the evening, and Henrietta could hear, at intervals, the low sound of him talking to the roan mare. The same conversational tone he always used. At 3 in the morning, under a sky still full of the stars that Kansas produced with such extravagant abundance, Marion put a small, red-faced, loudly opinionated boy into Henrietta's arms. "A boy," Marion said, with satisfaction. Henrietta held the child, this real, astonishing, entirely new person, and looked at him and felt the particular vertigo of love that is unlike any other love, that comes on suddenly and completely and reconfigures everything it touches. Thomas came in when Marion fetched him, still dusty from the barn, and he stopped in the doorway of the bedroom and looked at Henrietta holding the baby, and she watched his face do the thing it did when something mattered beyond what his usual composure could fully contain. He came to the bedside and she turned the baby toward him, and he looked at his son for a long moment, and then he put one large, careful hand under the child's head and held him with the complete focus and gentleness of a man to whom this was the most important thing he had ever held. "Hello," he said to the baby, quietly, not to anyone else in the room, just to the baby. "What shall we call him?" Henrietta said. Thomas looked at her. "What do you want to call him?" "James," she said. "James Thomas Hawkins, if that is all right with you." Something moved across Thomas's face. "That is more than all right," he said. "That is exactly right." James Thomas Hawkins was a loud and enthusiastic baby who expressed opinions about everything, and settled into the rhythms of the claim as if he had always been there, which in some important sense he had, growing through the long Kansas autumn that had followed his parents' first meeting, and through the winter of their marriage, and through the spring of their deepening. He grew fast the way frontier children do, as if the wide land around them communicates something about the necessity of growing toward it. He had Thomas's gray eyes and Henrietta's dark hair, and a temperament that combined their respective directness with an additional layer of pure, exuberant sociability that seemed to belong entirely to himself. By the autumn of 1876, he was walking, and had developed a particular attachment to the roan mare, who accepted his attentions with the long-suffering tolerance of an animal that has been talked to by one member of a family, and has simply extended the accommodation to the next generation. Thomas would hold James in his arms at the paddock fence and let the boy reach out and touch the horse's nose, and the mare would blow softly and James would shriek with delight, and Thomas would look across the paddock fence at Henrietta watching from the porch, and the expression on his face was one she kept collecting, adding to the catalog of his expressions that she had been building since that first day, the one that said everything was exactly as it should be. Eli and his family came from Missouri in the spring of 1877, a journey that Eli had been planning and delaying for 2 years, and that Thomas had finally half demanded and half invited in a letter that Henrietta had, with Thomas's permission, mostly written. Eli arrived with his wife Clara and their 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, in a wagon that had been on the road for 4 days, and was considerably the worse for it, and the meeting between the 2 brothers in the yard of the Wallace Hawkins claim was one of those moments that Henrietta watched from a slight distance and did not interrupt. They looked at each other for a moment, 2 men who had been separately shaped by the same childhood, and then by the same war, and then by years of different choices and accumulating distance. And then Eli put his arms around Thomas and Thomas put his arms around Eli, and she saw Thomas's eyes close briefly, and she turned away and went to help Clara down from the wagon and start coffee. The visit was a week long, and it was the kind of week that becomes a marker year, the kind of time you refer to later as before the Missouri visit and after the Missouri visit. Eli was quieter than Thomas, more prone to worry, but there was a goodness in him that was unmistakable, and Clara was a woman of such genuine warmth and practical competence that Henrietta liked her immediately and felt, in her company, something like the beginning of a friendship that could travel the distance between Missouri and Kansas in letters and be renewed at intervals. The children ran through the property in a rolling, chaotic pack that centered on young James and occasionally knocked into things, and once frightened the chickens badly enough that Thomas and Eli spent an afternoon repairing the henhouse door that had been caught in the commotion, working side by side and talking in the low, steady voices of men who are slowly rebuilding a bridge. By the end of the visit, it was clear that the bridge was not what it had been before the war, but was something real and repairable, and worth the work. When Eli's family loaded up the wagon on the last morning, Eli shook Thomas's hand and then pulled him into another embrace, and said something against Thomas's shoulder that Henrietta did not hear, and Thomas nodded into his brother's shoulder, and Clara hugged Henrietta and said she hoped they would come to Missouri in the autumn, and Henrietta said she would write, and she meant it. They stood in the yard and watched the wagon until it was gone, and James stood between them holding both their hands, though at nearly 2 he considered hand-holding optional and mostly a concession to parental anxiety. "He is a good man," Henrietta said. "Your brother." "Yes," Thomas said. "He always was." "I forgot that for a while." She took his hand and held it, the way she had done from that first evening on the porch, and they stood in the Kansas summer morning with their sun and the land around them, and the roan mare visible in the paddock, and the young apple trees showing 2 years of growth along the south fence. The autumn of 1877 was the best harvest they had yet had. The rains had been right, the summer long and warm in the good way rather than the punishing way, and they brought in more than they needed, and sold the surplus in Caldwell at prices that were fair for once. And Thomas came home from that trip to town with supplies and a bolt of blue fabric because he had seen it in the dry goods store and thought of her blue dress and thought she might want it for whatever purpose she saw fit. She made a dress with it over 3 evenings at the kitchen table, sewing while he read and James slept, and when it was done she put it on and stood in the lamplight, and he looked at her with those warm gray eyes and said, "That is exactly the right color for you." "You have very specific opinions about fabric," she said. "I have very specific opinions about you," he said. She smiled at him, and he crossed the room and kissed her. And James, who had woken from his sleep with the timing of a child who understands that his parents are having a moment, chose that particular moment to stand up in his bed and announce something in the loud, authoritative voice he had developed for important communications. They both laughed, and Thomas went to attend to the child, and she stood in her blue dress in the lamplight and looked at the kitchen, at the 2 carved figures and the hawk feather on the windowsill, at the worn table with its comfortable solidity, at the books on the shelf by the stove that were hers and his mixed together, at the child's things tucked in their corner, and she felt the full weight of her life as it actually was, which was large and warm and improbable and entirely real. In the spring of 1878, when the apple trees were putting out their first small blossoms, 3 years old, just beginning to suggest the orchard they would eventually become, Henrietta told Thomas she was expecting again. This time he did not still himself the way he had the first time. This time he laughed outright, the full laugh that she had spent years collecting as a particularly prized item, and pulled her to him in the apple orchard with the blossoms just opening around them and the Kansas spring making its extravagant argument for continuation. "2," he said. "2," she agreed. "James will be insufferable about it," he said, which was probably accurate given James's general personality. "He will be an excellent older brother," she said. "He will be an extremely opinionated older brother," Thomas said, "which is its own kind of excellent." The second child arrived in November of 1878, a girl this time, red-cheeked and furious-looking, and in possession of a voice that immediately established her as a force of nature. They named her Clara Alice Hawkins, Clara for Eli's wife, who had become the friend by correspondence that Henrietta had anticipated, and Alice for Henrietta's mother, who had died in Ohio the previous year, and whom Henrietta had grieved from the necessary distance of Kansas. James, who was 3, examined his sister with the air of someone conducting a formal assessment and then announced that she was small. Thomas told him that she would grow. James considered this and said that she could sleep in his room if she wanted to, which was as generous as it was logistically complicated, and Thomas thanked him gravely for the offer. Marion Cooper came for the birth in the first week after, and held Clara with the careful expertise of a woman who had held many babies, and said that she was a good, strong one and would give them trouble in a few years, which proved accurate. Marion herself was 67 by now and moved more slowly than she had, and Henrietta had started worrying about her, a worry she expressed to Thomas, who expressed it back, and between them they had developed the practice of checking on Marion with the regularity that Marion considered excessive and they considered minimal. The following spring, after a particularly hard winter that had been hard on everyone in the county, Marion Cooper accepted Henrietta's invitation to spend several months at the claim, rather than managing her own property through the worst of the season. And over those months, what had been a semi-regular arrangement became a permanent one, worked out with the directness that characterized all their conversations. Marion would sell her own claim, which had been too much for one person for several years, and she would live with the Hawkins family, contributing what she could and taking the room at the back of the house that Thomas had expanded for the purpose during the summer. Marion received this arrangement with the dignity of someone who knows when to accept help and does so without confusing it with defeat. "I am not a charity case," she said. "I have enough from the sale of the claim to contribute." "We are not asking for your money," Henrietta said. "We are asking for your company." "And your opinions," Thomas said, "which are useful even when they are delivered without invitation." Marion looked at him sharply, and then the corners of her mouth moved in the minimal expression that constituted a smile in Marion's emotional vocabulary. "You are a tolerable man, Thomas Hawkins," she said. "Highest praise," he said. "Do not push it," she said. The claim expanded in 1880. They purchased an adjacent parcel from a family who had decided Kansas was not for them, and were heading back east, adding 60 additional acres that gave them good pasture land and a second well. Thomas hired 2 hands for the busy season, young men from Caldwell who were strong and willing and learned quickly, and the operation had the scale now that made it sustainable in a way that the original claim, even working perfectly, always carried a precariousness about it. The apple orchard bore its first real fruit in 1880, 7 years after Thomas had ridden onto her land demanding water. The apples were small and imperfect, and the best thing Henrietta had eaten in as long as she could remember, and she stood in the orchard in the September afternoon eating one, and looking at the trees and thinking about the morning she and Thomas had stood here with the young trees barely more than planted sticks, and talked about being 43 and 41 and eating apples in middle age. She was 38. He was 40. The middle age they had discussed was not quite here yet, but it was coming, and she found that she was entirely at peace with its arrival. Thomas came across the field toward her carrying James on his shoulders. James was now 6 and considered shoulder rides beneath him in principle and irresistible in practice, and Clara running ahead of him with the particular focused speed of a 3-year-old who has somewhere to be. "Apples," Clara announced, arriving at the orchard. "Yes," Henrietta said. "Come and see." She gave Clara an apple smaller for the smaller hands, and Clara bit into it with the complete and unself-conscious pleasure of a child eating something good. And Thomas lowered James to the ground, and James also acquired an apple, and Thomas took one himself, and they stood in the orchard and ate apples in the September afternoon, 4 people in the middle of the Kansas plain, under the large and generous sky. Thomas looked at Henrietta across the heads of the children, and she looked at him, and between them was 7 years of everything. The daily work and the hard seasons, and the good harvests and the laughing evenings, and the dark nights when the war came back to him. And she was there, and the bright mornings when the land showed itself in its best light and everything felt possible, and the medium ordinary days that were neither dark nor bright, but just the warm fabric of a life, ordinary and irreplaceable. "You were right," he said. "About which thing?" she said. "About this land," he said. "About it being worth fighting for." She smiled at him. "You helped. You started it," he said. James looked up from his apple. "Started what?" "Everything," Thomas said, and put his arm around Henrietta's shoulders, and she leaned into him the way she had learned to lean fully, without reservation, with the complete trust of a person who has tested the thing they are leaning on and found it will hold. The Kansas evening was coming in around them, the sky beginning its display in the west, and Marion could be seen on the porch of the house in the distance. She had taken to sitting on the porch in the evenings, claiming it was for the fresh air and not admitting that she liked to watch the family come in from the fields, though Henrietta knew the truth of it and said nothing. The roan mare was visible in the paddock, older now but still moving with the same quality, the same particular character of self. The chickens were settling in for the night with the ancient avian confidence that tomorrow would contain more chickens. James finished his apple and immediately requested another, and Clara, not to be outdone, also requested another, and Thomas picked two more from the nearest tree with the satisfied air of a man fulfilling a function he was born for, and the children ran back toward the house with their apples and Henrietta, and Thomas followed more slowly, walking close together through the orchard with the low September sun laying their shadows long across the grass. "Henrietta," he said. "Thomas," she said. "I want you to know something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "That day on the trail," he said, "riding north, I was not doing well. I had been not doing well for a long time. I was cracked ribs and a dry horse and somewhere between 40 miles of nowhere with no particular reason to think the situation was going to improve." He walked a few steps in silence. "And then there was you, standing at your fence with your rifle across your arms and your no-nonsense expression, and you said, 'Ride around to the well east side of the house. I will meet you there.' And you said it like it was the most ordinary thing in the world to be kind to a stranger in the middle of nowhere, Kansas, on a July afternoon." She was quiet, listening to him. "I want you to know that you saved my life," he said. "Not in the dramatic sense, though the water helped. In the actual sense. You gave me a reason to turn around and come back. You gave me something worth staying for." He paused. "You gave me everything worth staying for." She stopped walking and turned to face him in the orchard, with the apple trees around them and the long evening light and the sound of the children somewhere ahead of them getting closer to the house. She put her hands on either side of his face, those hands that were strong now and roughened and capable, that had given water to a sick horse and cleaned a stranger's wound and planted apple trees and held two children into the world and repaired 1,000 things and held this man in the dark when the war came back for him, and she looked at him with everything she had. "You gave me the rest of your life," she said. "That is not a small thing." "No," he said. "It is not." "It is the largest thing I have," he said. She kissed him in the orchard, with the apples around them and the evening coming in, and the children shouting something to Marion on the porch, and the whole complicated, irreplaceable, ordinary, extraordinary life of them spread out in every direction from this moment. This one moment that was no different from, and no less than all the others that had led to it, and all the others that would follow. When they walked back to the house, Marion was on the porch holding Clara on her knee, and James was conducting an inspection of the porch floorboards for reasons known only to himself. And the lamp was on inside, and the smell of the evening meal came through the screen door, and the sky to the west was going into the colors that it only made over the flat Kansas plain, extravagant and unashamed. Thomas held the door open for her and she went inside, and he followed her in, and the door closed behind them both. The years that followed were built of the same materials as the years before: work and weather, and the stubborn persistence of living, and the particular grace of doing it, alongside someone who knew you completely and chose you anyway. They had a third child in 1883, another boy they named Robert William Hawkins, who arrived with the same focused intensity as his sister, and immediately began establishing his own personality as distinct from both his siblings in ways that became clearer by the month. James was by then 8 and had developed a serious interest in the mechanical workings of the pump and other farm equipment, a tendency he had inherited from his grandfather, the millwright, by way of Thomas. Clara was 5 and had appointed herself chief social organizer of the family and all surrounding areas, a role she took seriously and executed with considerable competence. Marion Cooper was still on the porch in the evenings, sharper-minded than most people half her age, conducting her gentle surveillance of the family's comings and goings with satisfaction. She had become the children's person in a way that surprised no one who knew her. They had discovered early that beneath the iron exterior of her was someone who had an infinite patience for children and their questions, and who told stories about the frontier in the old days that made them sit very still and listen with their mouths slightly open. Thomas and Eli had rebuilt what had been broken between them into something that functioned well, corresponding regularly and visiting twice more in the years since the first Missouri visit, and the children of both families knew each other as cousins in the full sense of the word. Eli had found his way, over the years, to asking Thomas about the war in a way he had not been able to ask when Thomas first came home, and Thomas had found his way to answering in a way that was honest without being burdened. And between those two things, the distance that the war had made between them had mostly, carefully, been closed. In the evenings, when the children were asleep and Marion had retired to her room, and the house was quiet, Henrietta and Thomas would sit on the porch the way they always had, in the 2 wooden chairs that had been there since James Wallace built the porch, that she and Thomas had repaired twice and would repair again as needed, and the Kansas sky would perform its nightly extravagance above them. And they would talk or be quiet in the way of people who have run out of the need to fill silence, because the silence is already full. She would sometimes think about the woman she had been in July of 1874, standing alone at the north fence with her rifle and her worn dress, watching a stranger ride toward her across the baked earth, alone in the particular way of someone who has been alone long enough to have organized their whole life around the assumption of continuing alone. She thought about that woman with affection and with a kind of recognition that was more complex than nostalgia. She was still that woman, still carried all of what that woman had survived and built and chosen. But she was also this woman, here on this porch with the lamp behind her, and the man beside her, and the children inside and the land all around, the land that James Wallace had believed in and that she had held, and that Thomas Hawkins had ridden onto on a July afternoon demanding water as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world to arrive at the exact right place at the exact right moment. She had given him water. He had given her the rest of his life. It seemed, in every calculation she could perform, like an extraordinary and completely fair exchange. Thomas reached over in the dark of the porch and took her hand, the way he had done from the first evening, and she held his hand and looked up at the stars, those stars that Kansas produced every night with such unasked-for generosity, scattered across the full dome of sky from horizon to horizon, and she felt the completeness of her life as a physical thing, a weight that was entirely the right kind of weight, the kind you carry not because you have to, but because you would not put it down for anything. "Good evening," Thomas said, which was what he sometimes said when he was looking at the stars and feeling what she was feeling and could not find a better word for it. "Good evening," she said back. And the Kansas night held them, and the land held them, and the years ahead were full of apple harvests and children growing and letters from Missouri and Marion's opinions and mornings at the pump and evenings on the porch, and all of it was more than enough, and all of it was theirs.